Hi, everybody. Welcome to this live coffee chat with me, Laura, and
Matina. Hi, everyone. Hi, Laura.
thanks for joining me today, Matina. We're going to be chatting about feedback and error correction, which has been the theme throughout this month for EF Teach Online. If you haven't checked out our Instagram and also our blog space, you'll find lots of ideas and tips on the same topic. Now, Matina, you picked this topic for the month. Could you tell us a bit about why you chose this one for this monthly feature?
Yeah, absolutely, Laura. That's a good way to start, actually. It was a combination of a lot of different things. To start with, a lot of teachers had reached out to us to ask for more content on feedback, delivery, and error correction, particularly when it comes to the online classroom. And we felt we had a lot of good tips and practices to share with our teachers. We also wanted to see what educational trends there are at the moment, what the research says about feedback delivery and error correction, what sort of good practices there are. So it was a good opportunity for us to deep dive into that topic and really collate all of the useful information. And yeah, like you're saying, disseminate it in different ways. So we have our Instagram lives, we have our blogs, and we have this YouTube live where we're focusing on error correction and feedback delivery. So yeah, I think it was a combination of a lot of different things, and it is a matter that we keep talking about in different ways. We keep focusing on feedback delivery or error correction, and we keep discovering more things to say about it. So really excited to take a deep dive into this with you today.
Yeah, me too. This, like you say, this topic is quite broad. And I think even as experienced teachers, there's different ways in which we can give feedback to our learners, and no one way I find works all the time. It really depends on the context, the students, how they respond to feedback, and also what's being taught as well, like what model works well for like grammar or vocabulary point, or maybe the task and how they interacted. So it's always something I'm reflecting on in terms of my own practice. And I imagine it's the same for lots of other teachers, no matter where they're at in their career journey or experience level.
Absolutely. It's what we say, I think, about teaching is that because the human factor is always at play, whether that human is us as the teacher or our student, there will always be varieties that we can try. There will always be different factors to consider. One thing might work with one class. The same thing might not work with another class for different reasons. So it's always good to keep exploring.
You know, at the start of this, you mentioned like we've been digging into research on this topic, and I thought that'd be a good place to start before we go into the our favorite ways in which we give feedback, or at least some of our favorites. So I thought it'd be good to share from the top that we looked into the Education Endowment Foundation. They have a really interesting toolkit there, where they list different initiatives that schools have tried, whether, feedback being one of them, teaching learners about metacognition, how to learn, that is. And they rate them based on the amount of research that's out there, how robust that research is, the costing of initiatives in terms of how much resources or staffing schools needed to implement something, and also the impact it had on the learners. What was really interesting about feedback is that it was rated very high on the robustness of the research. So that means there's a lot of evidence out there that's well organized and well researched to support feedback as an initiative. It was rated as low cost, and in turn, in terms of the reward or return on investment, it was rated as adding up to 6 months of additional learning for students. And that's really high. I mean, it's the highest one, I think, was metacognition, with 7 months added. So it rates really highly on that toolkit. So I thought that was a really interesting piece of research. And of course, I can include the link later in the comments below for people to check out for that. I wasn't aware of that, but this research really kind of reflected what I sensed with my learners, but really kind of echoed it back in a much more kind of organized way. Did you have the same feeling about that, Matina?
I know exactly what you mean, Laura. I think it's something that we discover throughout our teaching career and our teaching sort of experience. We just know that delivering feedback works. Of course, there are different discussions to be held about how we deliver that feedback and how exactly we act on it and follow up on it. But if done right, absolutely. And to hear it quantified like that, to hear that 6 months of added learning, I think, like you're saying, it just validates what we already know, is that the evidence seems to be compelling, that feedback does work in learning. So yeah, let's see what sort of practices we like to follow, what our favorites are, and how that falls into place within the whole spectrum of evidence when it comes to feedback. Do you want to start with your favorite?
Oh gosh, you put me on the spot, because I feel
Shit,
like
I'm sorry.
my favorite isn't your favorite. So I was going to talk about reformulation
Yeah.
as one of the ones I actually enjoy doing. So this is when you don't really interrupt the flow of what students are saying. So for example, you may hear students say an error. So for example, I go to the shops yesterday, and in response to that, you can say, oh, really? I went to the cinema yesterday. What else did you do yesterday? So you you kind of re-provide the correct form, but without it being without interrupting the flow, or stopping and saying, hey, this is an error, and writing it on the board necessarily. So I really like this because it works well if I'm playing an active role in maybe a small class, or if I have an odd number of students, or I'm supporting students who need that little bit more scaffolding during a discussion activity or even a role play. I may use it there because, like I say, it doesn't interrupt the flow, and it can work really well in helping learners notice and self-correct. Does it work all of the time? Absolutely not. In fact, we did some really interesting research with a teacher where I was tasked to be his observer, and he asked me to observe his classes and note when he used reformulation as a strategy and how his learners responded. So were they able to self-correct? Did they notice, or did they continue making the same error? And it actually worked about 50% of the time, which I think is actually quite high as a success rate, perhaps. It may have been influenced by the fact I was there in the room and the students knew that he was trying out something. So these things could have factored in, perhaps. Have you used this technique and had similar results?
It's really interesting what you're saying, because I think every other teacher out there, I definitely did use this technique at the very beginning, but I found it not working as well for myself or for my students at the time. So I did sort of drop it. I think looking at the research, there are a lot of points, a lot of aspects, or a lot of processes of reformulation that make it conducive to learning. Just the fact that you're not interrupting the student, for example, and you're letting them allowing them the thinking time and the breathing time that they need to process the language, that is absolutely grounded in evidence. And also the fact that you're jumping in there with one of my favorite things from Scott Thornbury, where he talks about the just-in-time feedback, just when the student needs it, particularly when it's the target language or the target structure of the lesson. Just when the student needs it, you go in there. I think for me, what I am sort of questioning about reformulation is whether the student actually notices the error or not. I suppose that leads to a wider conversation of, if it's a mistake, they might notice it because they might know the correct structure. If it's the language of the day, there's more chance of them noticing it. If it's related to something else, perhaps it will go unnoticed. And we know that noticing and sort of paying attention, again, with the research that is out there, is very important when it comes to learning. So I think I can see definitely pros and cons with reformulation. But like you're saying, it's definitely got aspects of it that I'm intrigued by, and I know that can work. I think it just needs to be done right. Certain conditions need to be met, I suppose. Does that sound?
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. I think with all these strategies that we're going to talk about today, it depends on your learners, what you're doing. And I find an eclectic combination of a few different strategies works really well. So is this a strategy that I use when we're doing very focused work, where I want them to notice something, where we're just beginning to get to grips with a particular language point? No, it's not. It's not clear enough. It's not a clear enough flag. But if it is more of a fluency-based activity, like I mentioned, where I am probably more hands-on to support those learners, I think that works quite well. And then we do some delayed feedback as well to see what they noticed, what they didn't, where they feel they did well in, and also those areas to improve. So it's definitely not a catch-all solution, but it's definitely one that I find myself using. And it just, yeah, like I said, it keeps things going, keeps the pace of the lesson going. Do students sometimes notice the error and correct themselves, or start using the correct form as we progress? Yeah, and I think that's quite good in maybe a role play or freer practice task, shall we say.
Absolutely, absolutely. I completely agree. I don't think there is a one size fits all
No.
solution for feedback anyway. So
If
I
only
think
there was.
exactly. I think the best we can do is take these good points from the different strategies and hope for the best.
So we have a few others to talk about. So we started, thanks very much with one I really like to talk about. How about you? What's one of your favourite strategies for giving feedback to learners?
I would say my favorite in terms of how much I use it in the classroom is using nonverbal cues to give feedback, particularly in the online classroom where I know that the camera is pointing directly at me and I can use my facial expressions, my body language as much as possible. I can use, I can zoom in into my mouth, for example, if I'm giving feedback on pronunciation.
Yeah.
I can make use of annotation tools. So I think generally just not speaking to allow time to the student, first of all, to notice the error, and then also to give them the opportunity to self-correct if they can. If it's a mistake, it's more likely that they will be able to do it. If it's an error, it's probably harder. But yeah, in general, I find that, and in looking at the research again, I can't say that I have found something that says, this is this is the preferred way of giving feedback. What it does, again, specific aspects of it that work, is that it can help me help my students, help lower my students' affective filter. So it can help that positivity and that sense of encouragement and belonging and the safe environment my students are in, and therefore create an environment that's more conducive to learning. Particularly important when it comes to giving feedback and as a student receiving feedback, because that can be an emotionally charged experience depending on the student's goals and
Yeah.
needs. I have taught students in the past that we're going to take important exams, the IELTS exam, for example, because they wanted to immigrate to a new country, or they wanted to really get that job that required a 7.5 at IELTS. So that is a difficult process to go through, and sort of hearing feedback, particularly when it comes to corrections, it's not always easy. I have been there myself. I have seen it in my students, and I think that is one of the ways that I can just keep that positivity in the classroom. And also it reduces my teacher talking time. Have you ever tried this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things you just said as well when you were talking about this, like reducing teacher talking time and giving students thinking time, I think that's so important. One of the things I've looked at before is the amount of thinking time on average we need to give learners. And of course, it can be more or less depending on their level and the complexity of the language that they're processing in relation to their level or the languages they speak. Maybe that concept doesn't exist in their own language, so it needs a bit more processing time. And on average, they need between 7 to 12 seconds. I found in the research I've read, and apologies, I can't remember from the top of my head that research, I'll have to dig it out. But that's quite a long time, or it can feel like a long time in a live classroom setting. So I think using these nonverbal cues, such as you said, like an annotate tool in an online classroom to highlight things, circle things, or maybe use different shapes to highlight where an area is or leave a gap where there's a problem in a sentence, really just gives learners time to process and think and maybe talk to each other as well, hopefully, to troubleshoot. So you're giving them a bit more autonomy rather than just you don't want to give them the answer. You want them to kind of think about it and maybe provide some scaffolding. But ideally, you really want learners to be able to come to their own conclusions because it's more likely to stick then, at least it is in my experience, if they're able to work it out for themselves. Yeah, definitely a favourite of mine. You mentioned it in the online classroom. Face-to-face is quite easy as well in the physical classroom. I think it's not until I watch back videos of me teaching that I've realised I could probably get a degree in mime because I use so much facial expression and hand gestures and, thumbs up and stuff. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I didn't realise I did that.
But that's one of the great ways, particularly one of the great things about watching yourself teach is observing yourself how much you're using certain methods out there, and then you
Yeah.
can think about how you can pair them with other practices that you've been following to make them even more impactful in the classroom. So, for example, pair body language with spoken feedback, and just make it something that I think that we instinctively sometimes do. That again may be very aiding learning with students.
It's just awkward to watch, isn't it? I think when you have to listen back or watch yourself teach, it's
Always.
always a little bit uncomfortable, but useful nonetheless. So we've covered reformulation. We've talked about nonverbal feedback. There was one other that you wanted to talk about today. What is it?
Yes, I think it's the one form of delivering feedback that's I almost want to say a tale as old as time. Is using the board to give written feedback, and I wanted to talk about this sort of method of delivering feedback because I found myself not doing it almost at all at the beginning of my teaching career, and the reason for that was very simple. It was because it felt like a tool of the past to me
Okay.
without
Yeah.
thinking too deeply about it, or perhaps because of my educational background and how my teachers had been overusing the board sometimes. It just felt like, I have this technology, I have all sorts of other aids. Why would I use the board? And that went on until I had an observation with a former academic manager who pointed out to me, he was saying, you gave this written feedback, and back then I was teaching in a classroom, in a physical classroom, where I could write. We could write on the floor, we could write on the chairs. So I was using a lot of that. And he said, "But if you want the whole class to notice it, why don't you write it on the board instead?" And I said, "That's actually a good point. Why don't I?" And we sort of went into a discussion, and I realized that it is as old as time because it is one of the most important tools that we have at our disposal as teachers. Again, we would need to make sure that we don't overuse it, that we use it selectively.
Yeah.
But if we want to point something out to the whole class in writing, it is very easy to sort of highlight things there, leave a gap for a word that's missing, and invite the class, for example, to think about it, think about what's missing, highlight or color code. It's easy to play games using the board, running games, for instance. So I think it is definitely a tool that is sometimes underrated, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. How do you find yourself using the board?
I think I've always used the board. It's interesting though that you mentioned like it seems to go into your teaching beliefs, and I think belief systems are quite important in shaping how we teach and how we perceive our roles as teachers and roles of our learners, and what we think our learners expect of us, and how our own experiences shape our identity and what we do as teachers. That's really fascinating that conversation kind of helped to unpack that, and then reevaluate how this resource can be used. I've definitely, I've had to use the board. I mean, when I first started teaching, I taught in a very limited space, so we didn't have all the technology that I've had the privilege of using in other spaces, but that wasn't a bad thing. But I did have a traditional chalk board to work with, and I had a very large class I was teaching, so I had to use that resource. It's one of my key resources because it also helped to save my voice, so I wasn't having to project my voice all the time, and also provide a really useful model of language for my students, and also sentence structures. In that case, because it was such a large class and I had varying levels, it was 70 students I had in that class. It was my first proper teaching job, and I got thrown in the deep end, but they were so wonderful. Yeah, I had to make sure that I actually didn't write errors on the board, so I only provided the correct form, or I provide a sentence example with a gap. And the reason for this was that I had varying levels of students in that class. I mean, it was like an intermediate level, but some needed more support than others, but were a bit shy. So I was conscious not to put an error on the board just in case there was any confusion that it was in fact the correct form, and they noted it down because they were quite eager to take notes in that lesson. So I used it in that way, and it was a very good tool for that reason to, help propel them to then work with their partners or group huddles, in talking about what the correct form is and thinking of further examples. That worked really well.
That's a very good point, and I'm glad that you brought this up actually, because like you're saying, you do need to make sure that what you're putting on the board, because everybody's attention will be there sort of instinctively. It
Yeah.
needs to be very clear what it is. So even standardizing how you present the information that goes in the board is really important. One of the things that I really got to hone during my Delta Module 2, during the teaching practice module, was using the board to the optimal level, really. So sort of organizing the information, if there's new words of the day, the new lexical items of the day, we put them on the right. If there are corrections, we put them on the left. So just sort of organizing them, excuse me, in a sort of in a way that students are familiar with and they expect.
Yeah.
Then it makes things more standardized, more templatized, if you will, and it makes them clearer for them. It really helps them sort of take charge a little bit of their journey, because if I want to write all of the new lexical items of the day on the right, not everyone may note them down, for instance, but some might, because that's their learning process. Some might start with some sentences for themselves, because that's their learning process. So yeah, as long as we do this and we give them different ways of how they can access and later use this information, I think the board can be a very powerful resource.
Absolutely. One of the teacher trainers that I worked with previously, Jill Crawshaw, she always used the metaphor of a plate setting and thinking of your board as a plate. So the middle space being a space where you can elicit and you're probably going to maintain by erasing bits and keeping it like a working canvas. And then thinking what you put to the side, like the fork or whatever cutlery you're using, what goes there, and then what goes in the top where your cup would be, and what would go where your knife is, and using that analogy to kind of help to organize the space. I thought is something that's always stayed with me. It's been very helpful in kind of structuring and making it easy for my students to interpret as they kind of get used to how I lay things out.
And I really like how we're putting the student at the forefront of our conversation, but also I think all of these processes are very important from the teacher's point of view as well. If I have specific routes that I follow, specific processes, then there's less for me to think about when I'm actually delivering a lesson. There's more headspace, there's less cognitive load when I'm actually teaching. And if it happens in an online setting where there does tend to be some more multitasking, again, depending on the activity, that can really help us as teachers go through our feedback, because we know exactly what we're going to do, when and how we're going to do it throughout the lesson. It's almost like we rehearse it from one lesson to the other and perfect it along the way.
I think that's a lovely sentiment to kind of close this live chat on. And I encourage people who've been watching this live to comment along your ideas or in the descriptions below in this recording, if indeed you're watching the recording. Matina, this has been lovely having this live chat. I feel really inspired to kind of revisit and think about what I'm doing in terms of feedback and do a bit of action research.
Same here, Laura. Yes, you gave me a lot of food for thought today, and I hope we gave some food for thought to and inspiration to our listeners as well.
Here's hoping. Let us know what you think. I'm looking forward to chatting to you again in our next live. So follow us on socials to stay up to date for when our next events are. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks, Matina.
Bye.
Bye.